On Christmas Eve, 1945, 5 children disappeared into the night, vanishing from their family home as flames devoured the building. Yet, no bodies were ever found. Was it a tragic accident, or something far more sinister? The mystery of the Sodder Children's disappearance still haunts America today. Could the truth be more complex than we've been led to believe for over 70 years? What if the fire wasn't the cause of their disappearance at all? What if the truth was buried in the smoke of that tragic night? While many believe the children perished in the fire, the reality is far darker. The myth of the Sodder fire and the mystery surrounding the vanishing remain shrouded in secrets, waiting for the pieces to fall into place. Take a moment to like and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here on The Silent Past. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world on these late-night historical journeys. Now, pause your notifications, dim the lights, maybe grab a soft blanket, and let your mind drift as we journey together into tonight's forgotten chapter of history. Now, let's dive into this haunting mystery, a tale of fire, loss, and the questions that still linger. The night of December 24th, 1945, was supposed to be like any other Christmas Eve, filled with joy, warmth, and the soft glow of festive lights. The Sodder family, George, Jenny, and their 9 children, were preparing to celebrate the holiday in their cozy home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The house, nestled in the quiet hills of the Appalachian foothills, was alive with the sounds of laughter, the rustle of wrapping paper, and the warmth of a crackling fire. Yet, what began as an ordinary evening would soon spiral into a nightmare that would haunt the family forever. In the early hours of Christmas morning, around 1 a.m., a fire erupted in the Sodder home. The first hints of smoke filled the air, drifting across the floorboards, unnoticed at first, as the family slept soundly in their rooms. The fire spread quickly, faster than anyone could have imagined, consuming the house with terrifying speed. But there was something deeply unsettling about the flames. The fire was consuming the structure from the inside out, yet there was no sign of the children. Jenny, George, and their 2 youngest children had escaped the blaze through a window, but the 5 older children, Martha, Jenny, Louis, Maurice, and Betty, were nowhere to be found. Strangely, despite the raging inferno, no remains of the children's bodies were ever discovered among the charred ruins. The family's frantic efforts to search the site yielded nothing. They scoured the smoldering remnants of the house, but all they found were ashes and twisted beams, the remains of a home torn apart by fire. The fire department's investigation raised more questions than answers. The authorities quickly concluded that the fire was an accident, a tragic but ordinary event. Yet this conclusion did little to ease the growing sense of dread that settled over the Sodder family. How could the fire have consumed the entire house so quickly, yet left no trace of the children? Where were they? And why was there no sign of their remains? The initial confusion and panic surrounding the fire were palpable, but what made the tragedy even more bewildering was the strange oddity that surrounded the entire situation. According to George Sodder, when the fire started, he had immediately attempted to drive the family's truck to the front of the house, hoping to rescue the children. Yet the truck's engine inexplicably refused to start, something that had never happened before. Had the children been trapped? Or had they somehow vanished before the fire had even begun to rage? The fire department's investigation found that the fire had been caused by faulty wiring, an explanation that seemed plausible at first, but the rapid spread of the flames and the absence of the children's bodies raised troubling questions. No sign of the children had been found, not even a single bone. Was it truly a fire, or was there something far more sinister at play? The lack of answers left the family haunted by a chilling uncertainty. In the days that followed, rumors began to circulate, and whispers of foul play spread throughout the town. George and Jenny refused to believe the official explanation. Could it be that the fire was a cover-up for something else? Could the children have been taken, their disappearance tied to a dark secret that had yet to be uncovered? But what if the fire wasn't the real story? What if the children had vanished before the flames even took hold? What if they had been taken by someone or something before the night could descend into disaster? These questions lingered in the air unanswered as the family tried to piece together the events of that fateful night. The world would soon come to know the Sodder family's tragic story, but it was only the beginning of a mystery that would stretch across decades, defying all logic and reason. In the cold, dark hours that followed the fire, confusion gripped the hearts of George and Jenny Sodder. As they stood in the ashes of their once vibrant home, the cries of their two youngest children, who had escaped with them, echoed through the night. But there was no sign of the 5 older children, Martha, Jenny, Louis, Maurice, and Betty. The fire had ravaged everything, yet their bodies, their remains, were nowhere to be found. It was a mystery too deep, too disturbing for their minds to fully comprehend. George and Jenny had fought valiantly against the flames, trying to save their children. George, in a frantic rush, had tried to start the family's truck to drive it to the front door, hoping to break through the wall of flames and rescue his children. But the engine, normally dependable, refused to turn over. The truck, which had always been reliable, suddenly failed in the most critical moment, leaving them with no escape route. There was no way to reach the children. In the midst of this chaos, Jenny had made her way to the phone to call for help, an emergency that should have been answered in an instant. Yet the phone line, which had always worked, was cut. The strange thing was that no one heard the crash of wires, no sign of anything physically wrong with the line. It was as though the phone itself had been severed in some invisible way, and no one could explain it. The confusion did not end there. As dawn began to break, the fire department arrived, and with them, the first signs of cold, hard facts, or so they thought. They scoured the site, combing through the rubble for signs of life. But despite the fire's overwhelming destruction, no remains of the children were found. Not a bone, not a trace. How could that be? The fire had burned hot, but it hadn't been hot enough to reduce human remains to nothing. There should have been something left, something that would tell a different story. Yet there was only ash. And then there was the strange detail about the smoke. When George and Jenny had run out of the house, they had noted something odd. Certain areas of the house had no smoke at all. It was as if the fire had avoided parts of the home, leaving strange pockets of untouched air within the house. The discrepancy in the way the fire spread, the unnatural speed with which it had consumed the home, and the silence around the children's disappearance cast an unsettling shadow over the official explanation. The fire, the smoke, the speed. All of it felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The fire department, in its hasty investigation, seemed to chalk it up to a tragic accident, claiming that the fire had simply burned too hot and too fast. Yet, George and Jenny couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something far more sinister was at play. And then came the phone calls, the ones that came shortly after the fire, each more bizarre than the last. calls from people who claimed to have seen their children, calls that hinted at a cover-up, at a deeper mystery yet to be uncovered. The official story didn't add up, and with no remains found, the questions mounted in the hearts of the parents. Had their children truly perished in the flames, or was there something darker at work, something hidden from view, tucked away in the very shadows of the night? With no sign of their children in the fire's aftermath, the Sodders began to question the official story. Were their children really lost to the flames? Was the fire the cause of their disappearance? Or were they victims of something far more insidious, something beyond the comprehension of the people who had investigated it? As the days turned into weeks, the official story of the fire began to solidify into something more tangible. A myth, a tragedy, wrapped in the certainty of an accident. The fire, the authorities claimed, had started in the attic and spread too quickly for anyone to escape. The conclusion was simple, almost too simple. The children, tragically, had perished in the flames. The community mourned, and the world moved on, accepting the fire as the cause of the family's grief. But for George and Jenny, the story never quite added up. The fire report, once thought to be a thorough investigation, was filled with inconsistencies. The first oddity was the claim that the fire had spread so rapidly that there was no way for anyone to escape. Yet those who had known the layout of the house couldn't reconcile that fact with the reality of the situation. The attic, though it was the starting point of the fire, was not near any of the children's rooms. The house had multiple exits, yet none had been blocked by the flames. How, then, had 5 children failed to escape? If the fire had spread so quickly, why was there no sign of their bodies in the ruins? More troubling was the matter of the children's remains, or rather, the complete lack of them. It was a mystery that weighed heavily on George and Jenny, who knew their children should have left something behind. No one could explain how such a hot, fast fire could reduce human bodies to nothing but ash. Even in the most extreme conditions, skeletal remains were usually found, if only as charred remnants. But there was nothing. No bones, no teeth, nothing that could confirm their tragic end. Local fire experts were baffled. One investigator suggested that the fire's rapid spread was due to faulty wiring, but even he couldn't explain how the bodies had simply disappeared. The flames had reached temperatures high enough to destroy much of the home, but they should have left traces of life behind. This, along with the strange pockets of air George and Jenny had noticed earlier, raised more questions than it answered. And then there was the matter of the fire itself. No one could quite explain why the fire had spread in the manner it did. How could a fire, burning so fiercely in some places, leave entire rooms untouched in others? The idea that this was a simple accident began to seem more like a convenient explanation, rather than the truth. In the weeks following the tragedy, the community began to accept the myth. The fire had been the cause of the children's deaths. It became the accepted narrative, one that offered a neat, albeit painful, closure. But for George and Jenny, that closure felt false. They clung to the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The inconsistencies in the report, the lack of remains, the strange patterns of the fire, felt like fragments of a larger puzzle that no one was willing to piece together. As the myth of the fire began to solidify, new mysterious clues started to surface. People came forward with strange stories, whispers of figures seen near the house the night of the fire, of cars that had been seen driving away from the scene at strange hours. Each story seemed more bizarre than the last, but together they painted a picture that didn't fit with the official account. Was it possible that the fire had been set deliberately, to cover up something far darker than a mere accident? Was it possible that the children had vanished long before the flames had ever touched the house? The myth was becoming more than just a tragic tale. It was becoming a narrative that obscured the truth. And as the years passed, the questions only grew louder. Had the children died in the fire, or had they been taken? The answers, it seemed, were lost somewhere in the smoke and ashes of that fateful night. As the months passed, the grief-stricken parents, George and Jenny, began to uncover strange, unsettling clues that led them to reconsider the idea of their children's death in the fire. What if, they thought, the children hadn't perished at all? What if the fire had been nothing more than a smokescreen designed to cover up a far darker reality? What if their children had been taken long before the flames ever began to burn? It was Jenny who first began to speak of what she had seen. In the days following the fire, she would recall vague but haunting memories of the night. As the hours of Christmas Eve drifted into the early morning, Jenny had noticed odd shadows moving in the yard. She thought nothing of it at first, dismissing it as the late-night wanderings of wildlife. But there was something about the way the shadows moved, too deliberately, too purposefully, that made her uneasy. She heard noises too, strange sounds coming from outside, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, followed by a low, distant hum, as though someone had been standing just beyond the light of the house, watching them. It wasn't long before these oddities began to feel like a prelude to something far more sinister. In the hours before the fire erupted, a phone call came through the house. The call was strange, and not just for its timing. Jenny, ever the attentive mother, had answered, but on the other end of the line, there was nothing but silence. For a moment, she wondered if it had been a prank, though it felt too calculated. There were sounds, distorted voices murmuring, but no words that Jenny could understand. She quickly hung up, but the feeling lingered, like a whisper at the back of her mind. Later, she would tell herself that the call had been some kind of omen, a warning of the horror to come. And then there were the sightings. In the days following the fire, people in the town began to whisper. Several individuals claimed to have seen the Sodder children after the fire, far too far from the house for anyone to believe the sighting could be an accident. A delivery driver reported seeing the children on a bus shortly after the fire, heading toward a town miles away. A neighbor recalled seeing the children walking along the road just after the fire had begun to burn out. Yet, no one could explain how they had escaped or where they had gone. The more Jenny and George thought about it, the more these sightings seemed to form a haunting pattern. How could their children have survived the fire, but not their own home? How could they have been seen so far away, yet not a single body was recovered? The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and disjointed, now seemed to fit together in an eerie, twisted picture of what might have truly happened that night. Was it possible, they wondered, that their children had been kidnapped before the fire ever started? Perhaps the flames had been set to destroy any evidence of their disappearance, to make it look like an accident, when in truth, they had been taken by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But the more they dug, the more questions arose. Why would anyone go to such lengths to take the children? Who would benefit from their disappearance? And what was the purpose of it all? Could it have been a random act of cruelty? Or was something far more deliberate at work? The answers seemed just beyond their grasp, like the shadows in the yard that had slipped away just before they could be understood. Jenny's mind could not shake the thought that their children had been alive long after the fire had smoldered out, and with each passing day, the mystery only deepened. No matter how hard they searched, no matter how many inquiries they made, the truth seemed forever out of reach. The idea that their children had been taken, kidnapped, was more than just a suspicion. It was a possibility that began to feel like an undeniable truth. The fire, perhaps, had been nothing more than a cover. But to what end? What had happened to the children, and who had wanted them so badly that they would go to such lengths to erase them from existence? The more they uncovered, the more it seemed the fire had been only the beginning of a much larger, darker conspiracy. Was this truly a kidnapping, or was something more nefarious at work? The immediate aftermath of the fire saw local authorities rushing to make sense of the tragedy. Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small, quiet town, had never witnessed anything like it. The fire that consumed the Sodder home was a tragedy that shook the community to its core. Yet, within days, the investigation seemed to come to a swift, unceremonious conclusion. It was ruled an accidental death, nothing more than a terrible, unfortunate event. There was no sense of urgency, no real effort to uncover the truth. A tragedy had occurred, and in the eyes of the authorities, that was enough. The fire, they said, had spread too quickly. The children's bodies had been burned beyond recognition, and that was that. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence suggesting anything beyond an accidental blaze. The investigation was closed, as if the case was already solved, and the town could return to its ordinary rhythm. But for George and Jenny Sodder, the conclusion felt like a slap in the face. Every part of the official story seemed incomplete, fragmented, and riddled with inconsistencies. How could 5 children disappear from a home consumed by fire, yet no bodies were ever found? How could such an intense blaze destroy everything, and yet leave no trace of their children? It didn't add up, not in their minds, not in the way they knew their children. The Sodders began to question everything: the timeline, the fire report, the supposed witnesses, and the conclusion that had been hastily drawn. There was no way they could accept the idea that their children were simply gone, swallowed by the fire, with no trace. It was simply too much to bear. The very thought felt wrong. They began their own investigation, reaching out to anyone who might be able to help. But the more they searched, the more frustrated they became. No one seemed willing to listen. The authorities, who had already closed the case, turned a blind eye to their increasingly desperate pleas. No one in the town wanted to dig too deep into the mysteries surrounding the fire. It was as though they, too, were willing to accept the simple, tidy explanation. After all, it was easier that way, wasn't it? But George and Jenny refused to be satisfied with the closure that everyone else had accepted. They weren't ready to let go. Every unanswered question weighed heavy on their hearts. Every inconsistency in the investigation gnawed at them, and they could not, would not, move on until they knew the truth. The simple narrative of the fire being an accident, of the children being victims of a tragic event, simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. The more they looked, the more the inconsistencies stood out like red flags, small, subtle clues that hinted at something more sinister, something deliberate. The investigation had been rushed, hasty, and seemingly uninterested in the possibility that the fire was anything but an accident. That should have been the end of the story, but for the Sodders, it was only the beginning. As they began to dig deeper into the evidence, their suspicions grew. The official investigation, they realized, had been a cover-up, a way to tie up a tragic event with a neat, convenient bow. There were too many unanswered questions, too many details that had been ignored. The fire department's report was full of contradictions. Neighbors had heard strange sounds before the fire started, but no one had bothered to investigate. The phone call Jenny had received before the fire had never been questioned. In the quiet of their home, George and Jenny pored over the details of the fire, the reports, and the testimonies, their frustration growing with each passing day. They had no choice but to take matters into their own hands. And so, with no one to turn to, they began to investigate on their own. Their search soon led them to a maze of oddities, a tangled web of missing evidence, half-truths, and overlooked details that pointed to something far more insidious than the official story allowed. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the fire was just a smokescreen, a carefully planned event designed to obscure the real reason for their children's disappearance. The Sodders' investigation into the fire and the events surrounding it had only just begun, but already they could sense that something dark, something hidden, lay beneath the surface of their quiet town. As they began their own quest for answers, they soon discovered a web of inconsistencies and cover-ups that suggested more than just a tragic fire. Days after the fire, as the wreckage of the family's former home smoldered in the cold winter air, Jenny Sodder received a phone call that would forever haunt her. It came in the quiet hours of the evening, a time when shadows seemed to stretch deeper and the night felt heavier. The voice on the other end was strange, distant, disconnected, almost mechanical. The person didn't introduce themselves, didn't offer any explanation for why they were calling. Instead, the voice simply spoke, its tone flat but strangely urgent. "I know where your children are," it said, before quickly hanging up. Jenny stood frozen, the receiver still pressed to her ear. The words echoed in her mind, reverberating through the hollow emptiness of her thoughts. "I know where your children are." The words didn't feel like a promise. They felt more like a warning, as if something had been whispered from a place far darker than she could comprehend. There were no other details, no location, no hint of who the caller was or how they knew anything about the children. It was as if the voice was simply offering a cryptic clue and then vanishing into the night, leaving nothing behind but an oppressive silence. The call came from a nearby city, though the number was untraceable, and no one could find any lead to follow. The unsettling nature of the call, the lack of connection, only deepened the mystery. Jenny's heart raced as she tried to make sense of it. Was it a cruel prank? Or was it a warning, a sign that someone out there knew something important, that they hadn't yet revealed? The police dismissed it as a hoax, but Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that this call was somehow tied to the disappearance of her children. The voice on the other end of the line had known something it shouldn't have. But it was just one more puzzle piece, one more layer in the thickening fog of uncertainty that surrounded the fire and the fate of the 5 missing children. It was a call that raised more questions than answers, and yet, in its eerie simplicity, it seemed to suggest something far more sinister at play. Perhaps the caller knew more than they had let on. Perhaps they had been watching. And if they knew where the children were, why hadn't they said more? As Jenny tried to make sense of the strange, unsettling phone call, it became clear that the more she uncovered, the deeper the mystery grew. The phone call, just like the fire, was one more piece of a much larger, much darker puzzle, a puzzle that had no easy solution, no satisfying answers. The call was just one more piece of the puzzle, but it left more questions than answers. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a strange pattern began to emerge. A series of unverified sightings, fleeting glimpses of children who might have been the missing Sodder siblings. One by one, neighbors, strangers, and even travelers passing through Fayetteville began to report seeing 5 children, matching the descriptions of the lost siblings, in places far from where the fire had consumed the Sodder home. At first, these reports seemed like little more than coincidence. A person who could have sworn they saw the children in a distant town, or a farmer claiming to have noticed them walking down a nearby road. But as the reports grew more frequent, a sinister possibility began to take shape in the minds of the Sodder family. the children might still be alive. A local merchant, who had never met the Sodder family but knew of the tragedy, claimed to have seen the children at a service station some 50 miles from their home. He described them as being with two unknown men, tall, dark figures who seemed to be guiding the children away from the gas pumps. The merchant didn't approach them, but his gut instinct told him something was wrong. Something in the way the children were behaving, nervous, unsure, didn't feel right. Another report came from a motorist who swore he saw the children standing at the edge of a small town, their faces hidden beneath a veil of shadows. They were standing by a car with strange license plates, their eyes wide and alert, almost as though they were waiting for someone to arrive. But before the motorist could make sense of it, the children vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving nothing behind but the unsettling feeling that they had been there, and then, just as swiftly, gone. And then there was the strangest of them all. A truck driver traveling through West Virginia in the weeks after the fire told authorities that he had seen 5 children, identical to the missing Sodders, inside a building at a rundown warehouse. The trucker said that he thought he had glimpsed their faces through a crack in the wall, but by the time he had pulled over to investigate, the children were gone, as though they had never been there at all. These reports were not confined to just a few isolated individuals. They came from different people, in different towns, at different times. All of them claimed to have seen the same children, and yet none could provide concrete evidence to confirm their stories. Each sighting was shrouded in a veil of uncertainty, adding a layer of intrigue that seemed impossible to ignore. The authorities dismissed these claims, chalking them up to confusion or mistaken identity. But for George and Jenny, each new report was like a crack in the foundation of the official story. If the children had perished in the fire, how could they be alive? And why, if they were alive, were they hiding from their parents? The truth seemed to slip further and further from their grasp with every passing day. The more they heard of these strange sightings, the more it felt as though the children might have been deliberately hidden, removed from their home, their lives, as part of something far darker than a simple accident. It was as if the children were still out there, but someone had gone to great lengths to keep them from being found. As the years passed, these sightings grew more frequent, each one adding fuel to the fire of doubt surrounding the official story. The possibility that the children had been deliberately taken, rather than lost to the flames, seemed to gain traction with each new report, and with it, the mystery deepened into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Determined to uncover the truth, George and Jenny Sodder took matters into their own hands, hiring private investigators to explore the case further. They refused to believe that the fire had claimed the lives of their children without a fight, without an explanation that made sense. What they discovered in the months that followed only deepened the mystery and reinforced their growing suspicion that there was something far darker at play. The investigators they hired, 2 men with years of experience in solving missing persons cases, began their work in the shadows. What they uncovered was troubling, to say the least. Despite the fire being declared accidental by the local authorities, evidence began to surface that cast serious doubts on the official findings. First, the investigators learned of strange activity in the days leading up to the fire. An unfamiliar vehicle seen parked near the Sodder home several times. Neighbors reported seeing a car with an unusual license plate parked in front of the house late at night, and several of them recalled hearing the sounds of footsteps or muffled voices outside, just hours before the flames began to engulf the house. But it was the presence of an unknown man that raised the most questions. A man who had been seen lingering near the family home in the days prior to the fire, his face obscured, his movements shifty and deliberate. He was described as having dark hair and a heavy-set frame, though none of the locals could provide a clear identification. The man was never mentioned in the official police report, despite the fact that witnesses had noted his suspicious behavior. The investigators also uncovered unsettling evidence that local authorities had not followed up on important leads. A witness came forward with a startling account. The night of the fire, they had seen a man standing near the Sodder property, fiddling with a wire outside the house. It was enough to raise questions about the possibility of arson, whether the fire had been set deliberately with the intent to destroy the house and silence anyone who might know the truth. But the investigators found more. They learned of a man who had been working at a nearby gas station in the weeks before the fire, who had been overheard talking about the Sodder family. He was heard saying something strange, that the family would soon be out of the picture. The comment was brushed off by those who overheard it, but it remained in the back of the investigators' minds as they tried to piece together the story. Even more disturbing was the reluctance of the town's authorities to pursue these leads. George and Jenny were met with a wall of silence from many of the locals who had once been their neighbors. It became apparent that there was something the town was hiding, a reluctance, or perhaps even an unwillingness, to help uncover the truth. The local authorities, already eager to close the case, seemed uninterested in following the evidence. The more the private investigators dug, the more they encountered dead ends and unexplained resistance. It was as though someone was trying to keep the investigation from uncovering the truth, protecting something far darker than an accidental fire. As they ventured deeper into the mystery, it became clear that the story was far darker than anyone had imagined. The fire was only the beginning of a far-reaching conspiracy that stretched deeper into the town's history. A conspiracy that left the Sodder family in the dark and struggling to make sense of the fragmented pieces of their children's disappearance. Each new detail, uncovered by the investigators, only served to deepen the shadow surrounding the case, and the Sodders became more certain than ever that their children had been taken, perhaps by someone within their very community. The weight of these discoveries hung heavy over the family, but they knew they couldn't stop now. They had come too far to turn back, and each revelation brought them closer to the truth, even if that truth remained frustratingly out of reach. As the investigation into the fire and the disappearance of the Sodder children continued to unfold, an unsettling theory began to take root. The more George and Jenny uncovered, the more they became convinced that the fire had not been a tragic accident. It was, in fact, a deliberate act designed to cover up something far more sinister. Was it possible that the fire had been a smokescreen, masking a much darker and more dangerous conspiracy that had been playing out right under their noses? The idea that the fire was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader, orchestrated plot, began to take hold when George recalled his past. A quiet, proud man, George had spent his entire life working hard to provide for his family, but there were things about him that didn't fit in with the local way of life. He had always refused to join the local businesses or organizations that dominated the area, including the local Chamber of Commerce. This decision made him something of an outsider in the small town of Fayetteville. Rumors had long circulated about George's defiant stance toward the local power structure, some of them suggesting that he had crossed paths with local criminal elements in the past. These were whispers, of course, but George's refusal to get involved with the established business elite made him a target for those who might have seen him as a threat. For years, George had been able to ignore these rumors, believing they were just idle gossip. But as the fire's mystery deepened, he began to wonder if there was a darker side to the story, one in which his family had become collateral damage in a much larger criminal conspiracy. The theory started to take shape when investigators began looking into the possibility of arson. The fire, which had spread so quickly, despite the lack of evidence for a major ignition source, suggested a more calculated plan. It didn't seem like an accident. It seemed like the work of someone who wanted to destroy the house and perhaps silence the family for reasons beyond mere vengeance. Could it be that the fire was meant to serve as a cover for a more nefarious plot, one that had its roots in the criminal activity George had long suspected but had never fully acknowledged? Was it possible that someone had deliberately set the fire, knowing it would draw attention away from other, more sinister dealings? Perhaps the local businesses had ties to organized crime or hidden dealings that George had inadvertently stumbled upon, earning the ire of those who had the power to make the Sodders disappear. Adding to the suspicions was the growing realization that several key figures in the town were involved in activities that seemed suspiciously tied to the events surrounding the fire. Local residents, who had been reluctant to help with the investigation, had strong connections to the town's business leaders, some of whom had a history of shady dealings. Could the criminal underworld have found a way to target the Sodders, using their home as a means to an end, while placing the blame on a tragic accident? The more the Sodders thought about it, the more they were convinced that their children's disappearance was not just about a fire. It was part of a larger scheme to erase something, perhaps even to keep the family from revealing a dangerous secret. The idea that the fire had been orchestrated to cover up a criminal plot was increasingly plausible, especially when they considered how quickly the local authorities had closed the case. It was almost as if there had been a deliberate effort to bury the truth as quickly as possible, to protect those who had a vested interest in keeping the public from knowing what really happened. The possibility that the Sodders had been victims of a calculated conspiracy, that their children were taken not by a fire, but by individuals who had the power to make them disappear, was a chilling realization. What if the fire wasn't just a tragedy, but a carefully executed plan to silence a family who had threatened to expose a larger, more dangerous web of corruption? As George and Jenny continued their search for answers, the shadows surrounding the case grew darker, and the conspiracy theory became harder to dismiss. Was the fire merely a smokescreen for something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine? Could the tragedy that tore their family apart have been part of something larger, a plot that reached deeper into the town's underbelly, where secrets were buried and the truth was too dangerous to uncover? Years passed, yet the Sodders' quest for the truth never waned. George and Jenny, though weary and broken by the tragic loss of their 5 children, remained resolute. They could not, would not, accept the official narrative that their children had perished in a fire that had been so full of contradictions, so many unanswered questions. Their children, where were they? Why had no remains been found, despite the ferocity of the blaze? Why were there no clear signs of death, no bones, no ash? The search for answers became an unrelenting obsession, a mission that spanned decades. With each passing year, they grew more determined, not just to find their children, but to expose the truth of what had truly occurred that Christmas Eve. In their hearts, they knew that their children had not died in that fire. Their instincts told them something far darker was at play, a conspiracy, a cover-up, a deliberate act that robbed them of their family. In 1950, 5 years after the fire, the Sodders placed an advertisement in the Fayette Tribune, offering a reward for information leading to the discovery of their children's whereabouts. The reward, a substantial amount of money, was an act of desperation, but also a symbol of their unwavering commitment. Despite the passage of time, despite the apparent indifference of the authorities, the Sodders refused to let go of the idea that their children might still be alive somewhere. Their hope, though diminished by years of fruitless searching, had not entirely died. They continued to believe that someone, somewhere, had answers, that someone might step forward to end their agony. But as the years passed, the frustrations mounted. No new leads came forward. The authorities, who had once so hastily closed the investigation, showed little interest in reopening the case. The Sodders were left to piece together the fragments of their own investigation, often finding themselves at odds with the same officials who had failed them all those years ago. The silence of the town, the lack of support from law enforcement, the constant dead ends, it all seemed to confirm that someone or something was deliberately keeping the truth hidden. Despite the overwhelming despair, there were moments when George and Jenny held onto a fragile thread of hope. They received occasional tips, some promising, others baseless, but each one reignited the flame of their search. They continued to receive reports of sightings of their children, though each one proved to be a false lead. Over time, the sightings became less frequent, but still, the Sodders never gave up. Every call, every scrap of new information was a small spark of hope that their children might still be out there, living, waiting to be found. The years wore on, and the pain of the past never fully healed. But in the quiet moments, George and Jenny held on to the belief that the truth was out there, somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. Their journey was not one of simple grief. It was a fight for justice, for answers, for the chance to bring their children home. Each new day, each new lead, was a reminder that they could never stop searching, never stop asking the questions that no one seemed willing to answer. And so, the search continued, not just for their children, but for the answers that would finally make sense of the horror they had endured. Through the darkness, the Sodders pressed on, hoping against hope that someday, somewhere, the truth would finally be revealed. But what the Sodders would eventually uncover, hidden deep within the recesses of the mystery, might just be the key to understanding their children's fate and unraveling the conspiracy that had stolen them away all those years ago. In 1967, more than 2 decades after the fire, the Sodders received a letter that would deepen the mystery and revive their hope once more. The letter, sent anonymously, arrived with a photograph of a young man. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but it was clear enough for Jenny to recognize the haunting resemblance to one of her missing children, Louis Sodder, the 4th child, who had been just 9 years old at the time of the fire. The letter was short, cryptic, and chilling. It read simply, "Louis Sodder is alive. He is with us." The fire was not what it seemed. The signature was absent, the handwriting unfamiliar, and the postmark was from a nearby city, far enough to be unsettling, yet close enough to suggest a connection to their small town. But it was the photograph that caused the most confusion and the most heartache. The young man in the picture bore an uncanny likeness to Louis, though he appeared older, perhaps in his 20s. The Sodders were overcome with a mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, hope, and fear. Was this a cruel prank, a hoax designed to prey on their desperate desire for answers? Or was it, as they feared, the long-awaited confirmation that their children were still alive, hidden away all these years, perhaps forced to live under another identity? Jenny, clutching the photograph, could not shake the suspicion that the person in the image was indeed Louis. The resemblance was undeniable. It felt as if the universe had whispered a secret to them, one that they had been waiting for, but also one that could not easily be accepted. After all these years, after the loss, the pain, the endless search for truth, this letter seemed to present a new, terrifying possibility. But it also raised new questions. Who had sent this letter, and why? What was the true significance of the message, hidden in the vague words that hinted at something far darker than a simple disappearance? Why had the letter arrived now, so many years after the fire? And why had it taken so long for this cryptic clue to surface? The Sodders were faced with a terrifying choice. Was this the breakthrough they had been praying for? Or was it just another cruel hoax, another twisted game played on their suffering? But as they stared at the photograph, at the familiar face of a child who had once been part of their world, the flicker of hope was undeniable. Could Louis truly be alive? Could their children have been hidden away, not burned in the fire, but taken from them, as they had long suspected? The cryptic letter left more questions than answers, and the mystery deepened, pulling the Sodders into a web of uncertainty and doubt that stretched even further into the shadows. The photograph, the message, the possibility. It was all too much to ignore. The letter was proof of something. But what? Proof that their children had been taken, that the fire had been a cover-up, or was it merely the latest cruel twist in an endless tragedy? With the letter in their hands, the Sodders were left to wonder. Was this proof that their children were still alive, or just another cruel hoax designed to torment them even further? The answer, it seemed, was still hidden in the silent past, waiting for someone, perhaps the Sodders themselves, to uncover it. As the years drifted by, the Sodder family's search for the truth began to fade, not due to lack of effort, but because of the cruel weight of silence that continued to surround the mystery. The events of Christmas Eve, 1945, haunted them in ways no one could understand. Despite their relentless pursuit, private investigators, phone calls, sightings, letters, and every other possible lead, the truth seemed to slip further and further away from their grasp, as if it had been swallowed by the very flames that had consumed their home. In the final years of their search, George and Jenny found themselves, once again, facing the painful reality that they might never know what truly happened to their 5 missing children. The official story of the fire, still locked in place by authorities, seemed almost too simple, too easy, in comparison to the complexities they had uncovered. The strange phone calls, the mysterious letter, the eerie sightings, all of it suggested a far darker and more complicated story than the authorities had ever cared to investigate. With each passing year, their hope waned. The last private investigator who worked with the Sodders was forced to admit that, without new evidence, the case was essentially closed. George and Jenny, now older, weary, and increasingly isolated in their search, began to realize that they might never have the closure they so desperately craved. The questions that had burned in their minds for decades — where were their children? Why had they been taken? And what truly happened in that fateful fire — remained unanswered. By the 1960s, the family had turned their attention towards something else, honoring the memory of their children. They had no more answers, but they had the undying love for those lost years ago, and that, in some small way, became their comfort. On the outside, they had come to accept the tragic loss, but in the quiet moments, the deep sadness never truly left them. The photographs of their missing children still hung on the walls of their home, preserved in time as a reminder of the children they loved, the children they never truly got to say goodbye to. Despite the lack of evidence, the family never fully stopped hoping, though their hope became more of a quiet mourning than an active search. The years of unanswered questions left a permanent mark on the Sodders, one that grew heavier with each passing year. The desire for truth remained in their hearts, But the certainty that they might never know what happened to their children eventually gave way to a quiet acceptance. The case, in its tangled web of mystery and unanswered questions, would remain open in the hearts of the Sodder family, though it would never find resolution in this world. As they mourned their children, the haunting question lingered in the air like smoke, fading but never quite disappearing. Where were the children? In the years that followed, the Sodders' search became less about the pursuit of answers and more about honoring the memory of their children. They would never stop remembering them, and their names would remain alive in the hearts of those who followed their story. Whispers of a mystery lost to time, yet never fully forgotten. The mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance, though never fully solved, has become one of the most chilling and persistent tales in American history. Over the decades, the case of the missing children has woven itself into the fabric of folklore, a symbol of unresolved grief that refuses to fade into the darkness of time. Fayetteville, West Virginia, where the tragedy unfolded, remains a town marked by questions and a deep, unsettling silence. The legend of the Sodder children endures, etched into the minds of those who still ask, what truly happened that night? The public, from the day the fire was deemed an accident to the many years after, has struggled with the haunting uncertainty surrounding the fate of the children. The theories, the stories, the unsubstantiated sightings. Each piece has contributed to a patchwork of mystery, creating a sense of collective unease. And yet, the reality of what happened on Christmas Eve remains forever out of reach, locked behind layers of confusion and cover-ups. Despite the efforts of the family, the investigators, and those who sought justice, the truth remained elusive. For the Sodder family, the pain never truly ebbed. George and Jenny's unwavering devotion to uncovering what had befallen their children transformed them into reluctant icons of heartbreak and determination. Their struggle became more than just a search for answers. It became a symbol for every family touched by tragedy, by unsolved loss. As the years passed, the case of the Sodder children took on an almost mythic quality. The local community, the press, and even the government seemed to resign themselves to the idea that the truth would forever be lost to time. The mystery was bigger than just one family's suffering. It became a part of the American consciousness, a reminder that sometimes there are questions that will never be answered, and grief that will never be resolved. But with every retelling, the story grew. The haunting question remained, did the children survive? Could they have been taken by someone, hidden away, or left to live under new identities far from their parents' reach? These questions linger in the minds of those who hear the tale, reverberating through the years like a dark echo. And so, the legend of the Sodder children remains, like a scar on the town of Fayetteville, a place where history and mystery collide. The family's search has faded, but the story continues to captivate. In a way, it will never truly end, because the questions it raised, the doubts it sowed, will persist as long as those who remember the Sodder children keep the mystery alive. The haunting spectre of those lost children, silent, unseen, but never forgotten, still looms large over the town and over the annals of American folklore. And so, the mystery endures, a testament to the enduring power of grief and the unknown. The legend of the Sodder children endures, leaving a scar on the history of the small town of Fayetteville, a scar that will never heal, but will never be erased either. The disappearance of the Sodder children, now nearly 8 decades in the past, continues to cast a long shadow over American history. It stands as one of the darkest mysteries of the 20th century. A tragedy marred by countless questions, broken promises, and an unrelenting silence that persists to this day. The fire, the strange sightings, the phone call, and the years of relentless searching, all of it has been woven into a tapestry of unresolved grief and lost answers. The silence surrounding the case is almost suffocating. Despite the efforts of George and Jenny, the private investigators, and the sporadic public interest, the truth has stubbornly refused to reveal itself. The unanswered questions, the most haunting being whether the children ever survived, or if they perished in the flames, remain locked away, sealed by time and circumstance. It is a silence that refuses to speak, even as it echoes across the decades. For the family, the pain of not knowing has never truly ceased. Their hope, though unshaken in the early years, slowly transformed into a weary acceptance that the answers may never come. And yet, even in their sorrow, they carried the memory of their children forward, offering up their own form of silent tribute to the vanished. Their search, their quest for closure, was not just for answers, but for some semblance of peace in a world that offered none. The legacy of the Sodder children is not just one of loss. It is a legacy of the unknowable. It is a story that is marked by what was never understood, what was never revealed, and what was forever left in the shadows. In this way, their story is not only a personal tragedy for the Sodder family, but also a universal reflection of how history, at times, chooses to remain silent. The vanishing of the Sodder children remains one of the darkest mysteries of 20th century America. Perhaps the truth will never be fully uncovered, but the silence that follows is a haunting reminder that some stories are never meant to be fully known. And so, the mystery endures. The silence lingers, a testament to the unknown, to the secrets that history chooses not to reveal, and to the families whose pain remains an echo in the dark. The silent past.